jangan komentar sebelum tonton video ini sampai habis ya.
In the Gospels, Jesus repeatedly says that he's going to die. Mark 9:31 says that Jesus was teaching his disciples and telling them, the Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later. But in Matthew 17:22-23, Jesus declares, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day. Christianity teaches that Jesus suffered and died, but that there was a point to his suffering and death.
Dan kalau Allah jadi manusia, dia harus berkuasa atas maut. Maut tidak bisa menahannya, dan dia harus mengalahkan maut. Buktinya, dia bangkit dari antara orang mati. 500 pasang mata menyaksikan dia bangkit dari antara orang mati dan naik ke sorga. Dia naik ke sorga untuk menyatakan dia kembali kepada ketuhanannya, kepada kealahannya.
That it feels right.
I've also to support my answer with reason, with evidence, and proof. I will now examine the image of Jesus as crucified Messiah. This is the image most present, most prominent in the writings of Paul, the most influential writer in the New Testament. Paul says, we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 23 in the NIV. Now here is the problem. A crucified Christ is a contradiction in terms. By definition, the Messiah has to be victorious over his enemies. What happens if he is killed by the enemy? But notice this. Paul wrote, if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is useless and your believing it is useless. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 14. So everything hangs on this one simple question, was Jesus raised from the dead? Now let me look at the evidence for the resurrection to see if there is any hope that Jay could actually persuade us tonight, or that anyone can persuade us that Jesus actually rose from the dead. In his paper, The Evidence for the Resurrection, Jay writes, and I quote him, the rule was that if your Messiah was killed, then obviously he was not the true Messiah. If he was crucified, he couldn't be the true Messiah. Jay may say, no problem, Shabir. Jesus rose from the dead, so he is the true Messiah after all. And I would say, okay, Jay, bring your proof.
What happened to Jesus after his crucifixion? The majority of scholars who have written on this subject agree that three things happened. First of all, on the Sunday morning following the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of women followers.
Jay can advance many arguments, and my reply will follow. The empty tomb proves nothing.
Secondly, on multiple occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups of people experience appearances of Jesus alive from the dead.
So let's look at that gospel. What is the total evidence in this gospel that Jesus reappeared to his disciples? Jesus' body is missing from his tomb. A young man in white clothes said that Jesus is raised and will be seen in Galilee. Mark does not say that this man is an angel and does not describe the actual reappearance of Jesus. You see the actual lack of evidence. According to Matthew, Jesus appeared to his disciples in Galilee, but according to Luke, the disciples were in Jerusalem all this time, some 90 miles away from the scene of the sighting.
And thirdly, the disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead despite their every predisposition to the contrary. I think the best explanation of these three facts is that the disciples were right. God had raised Jesus from the dead.
Another problem. The Gospels try to prove that Jesus reappeared, yet they often show that Jesus could not be positively identified. Matthew's Gospel says that the disciples saw Jesus and worshipped him, but some doubted. Matthew 28:17. The Living Bible says, but some of them weren't sure it really was Jesus. The New American Bible reads, but they doubted, which means they all doubted. If Jay cannot argue for the resurrection, speaking about these other topics that he's spoken about is really pointless. I leave you with these words of Paul. If Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is useless, and your believing it is useless. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 14 sightings. I leave it to Jay to give us some real evidence.
The proofs of the resurrection, we've talked quickly about them. The empty tomb, you say there was no empty tomb. If there was no empty tomb, why was no body ever found? To this day, no one has been able to come up with a body. Neither the Jews, neither the Romans. To this day, the tomb is still empty. If that's not proof of the resurrection, I don't know what is.
The empty tomb by itself is not going to prove anything. Just like you have an empty morgue, it doesn't mean that somebody has resurrected from the dead.
But you need to go back to the witnesses. You say that they had a difficult time understanding who Jesus was or recognizing him. I don't see that when I read the scriptures. I don't see where you're going with that.
And if you say that the disciples surely knew him, so they couldn't have doubted, well, then you're adding to my argument. Because if they knew him, and when they saw him, they couldn't recognize him, as I've showed from an actual verse in the Bible, Matthew chapter 28, verse 17, well, then that proves that there is something seriously wrong. Jesus did not look like Jesus.
There are many different instances in 1 Corinthians 15 that talk not only about those disciples that saw him, but over 500 who saw him at one time. They knew who their Christ was. They'd been with him for 3 years. Of course they recognized who he was. This was not a problem.
John chapter 20 shows that the disciples often sat around discussing these events. In the end, they should all have the same information. If they wrote the Gospels, or even supplied the information for the Gospels would not contradict each other on such fundamental issues. I will show that the Gospel evidence is marred by contradiction and doubt.
Yeah, so the last 12 verses of Mark are they're very interesting. Jesus has been dead, he's been crucified, he's dead and been buried. And on the third day, the third day, the women go to the tomb to see about anointing his body for burial, but they find the tomb's empty. Jesus isn't there. There's a young man in the tomb who says that Jesus will go, they're supposed to go tell the disciples that Jesus will go before them and meet them in Galilee. The disciples are supposed to go to Galilee, and the women are supposed to tell them to go. And then it says the women fled from the tomb and didn't say anything to anyone because they were afraid. That's the end of Mark's gospel. It ends with the women not saying anything. Well, some scribes read this ending and thought, well, that's odd. I mean, the women didn't tell anybody. I mean, surely the disciples knew. And so some scribes added a longer ending. So the last 12 verses are this longer ending, where the women do go tell the disciples. They do go to Galilee. Jesus does meet them there. And this is the passage where Jesus tells his disciples. Matthew and Luke have many of the stories in Mark, and sometimes they have the stories actually in the same words as Mark. And for hundreds and hundreds of years, since the 4th century at least, biblical scholars have recognized that the reason they have so many of the stories in the same words is that somebody's copying somebody else. And so the idea is usually thought that Matthew and Luke actually copied some of their stories from Mark. That's why they're verbatim the same in so many places.
But that is problematic because, as Dr. William Lane Craig asserts, you cannot just simply say that Jesus got up and rose from the dead on his own. God had to raise him from the dead. But as I pointed out to him, for God to raise him from the dead, God has to want to raise him from the dead. And if all we know is that he died under the curse of God, according to your scriptures, you have no reason for thinking that God would want to raise the accursed person from the dead, who died under the curse of his own law. So you have a contradiction here, and it's a major one, and that's another reason for believing that Jesus was not raised from the dead, and it's better to think that he did not die in the first place.
Again, thank you guys so much. Appreciate it.
Terima kasih ya yang sudah tonton video ini sampai habis. Jangan lupa untuk share video ini jika merasa video ini bermanfaat. Cek dan share juga video-video kami yang lainnya ya.